Tonight, I'm going to be sharing out of the book of Ruth. So if you will, open with me to the book of Ruth. If you can't find it, think about it that Joshua judges Ruth. That's how it goes. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Joshua judges Ruth. That's how I remember it. The title of my message tonight is The Redemption of Ruth. And I guess the first question would be, why does she need redeeming? Can you hear me all right? Yeah. All right, good. Why does Ruth need redemption? Ruth, if you didn't know, is actually a Moabite. And the Moabites were not part of Israel. They were not part of Israel. They weren't part of the people of Israel. And so Ruth here is stuck in the land of Moab. And we're going to go through the book of Ruth quickly. There's only 4 chapters. And we're going to see the process of redemption for Ruth. Last week, Joshua gave a message on Lot and how Lot was righteous and how the genealogy of Lot in his righteousness kind of came back into the fold of Christ through Ruth. And so God's been speaking to me about Ruth, and his message kind of re-emphasized Ruth and the importance of it, and so I felt like God gave me this. So let's start in the book of Ruth, chapter 1, verse 1, and it reads, "Now it came about in the days when the judges governed that there was a famine in the land, and a certain man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the land of Moab with his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi. And the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion, Epaphrathites of Bethlehem in Judah. Now they entered the land of Moab and remained there." First thing is this. Naomi represents the promise that God gives us. In ourselves, the Naomi is the promise within us that we've had since birth, that we've been given as a kid, maybe that we've just been given yesterday. But it represents the promise. But here's the thing about the promise, is that the promise and Elimelech, the promise's husband, they leave the land of promise, which is really Bethlehem in Judah. They leave Judah, and they go to Moab. Now, why do they leave? Because it says there was a famine in their land. Now, this was the first thing the Lord convicted me of. He said, Daniel, when your promise isn't getting fed and you're hungry, do you go to the land of Moab? Now, the land of Moab, if you recall from last Sunday, Joshua shared that the land of Moab and the people of Moab started because Lot's daughters wanted to preserve their line, and so they slept with Lot, their own father, and had an incestual son, the firstborn Moab. That's where you get the Moabites. In the land of Moab is where they lived. So, the land of Moab represents a land of self-preservation, and the land of Moab also represents the world. Self-preservation is one of the 5 I wills, the 5 iniquity drives that you find in Isaiah chapter 14. And it shows that Lot's 2 daughters were trying to preserve their own genealogy, their own life, their own bloodline. And in doing that, they slept with their father and had Moab. So the promise of Naomi and Elimelech, they go into the land of self-preservation, and they go into the world because they're not getting fed in the land of Judah. So first, we have to ask ourselves, in the redemption of Ruth, who we haven't even got to, is our promise leaving the land of Judah? Is your promise, is the part of you that God has given as a promise, when it's not getting fed, when it doesn't see the fruit, when it doesn't see the harvest, does it leave and get up and go into the world? Tough question. A lot of times I would say that our promises do get up and leave and go and search for food. And if we don't find it right here where God has us, we'll look for it somewhere else. So, in the land of Moab, let's keep reading. verse 3, it says, Then Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They took for themselves Moabite women as wives. The name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth. And they lived there about 10 years. So Elimelech and Naomi go into the land of Moab. Now, one thing that's interesting is that when they get to the land of Moab, who dies? Elimelech. Elimelech is the husband of the promise. And Elimelech's name means God is my king. Usually the first thing that happens when you go into the world, when you go into a land of self-preservation, is that Elimelech will die. God will not be your king. You will be your own king in search of your own food in a foreign land that you have no business in. But God knows our ignorance and our foolishness, and He's going to use this to work together for good. Amen? So, Naomi's 2 children, Mahlon and Chilion, they marry Orpah and Ruth. Okay? Now, Ruth is the one we're focusing on here, and we're going to see why we don't focus on Orpah in a minute. But it says in verse 5, Then both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and the woman was bereft of her 2 children and her husband. Then she arose with her daughters-in-law that she might return from the land of Moab, for she had heard in the land of Moab that the Lord had visited His people in giving them food. So, what happens after Elimelech dies? After you go into the world, you no longer have God as your king. He's dead. Then, your offspring, Mahlon means sick and Chilion means pining, the offspring of Naomi and Ruth, when they go into the land of Moab, they end up dying. But while they're in the land of Moab, God uses the law to bring Ruth into the family of Naomi. Okay? So, we have Ruth, we have Orpah, and we have Naomi. God has used the legal system of marriage to bring in Ruth and Orpah into Naomi's family. Remember, Naomi represents the promise or the promises that God has given. So, the sons die and there's just the 3 of them. And Naomi hears that God visits His people in giving them food. Isn't that usually what happens? You go into the world in search of your own food just to turn around and find out, hey, God just visited our people and we just missed it. And they're getting fed. Now we're in Moab. My husband died. My 2 sons are dead. I'm stuck with the 2 ladies who they were married to. And now the food, I have to go all the way back to Bethlehem in Judah. Man, that stinks. That's tough. Because you realize in this moment that God does provide for His people. And you don't find provision in the world. You didn't get fed in the world. You may have found some things while you're in the world that legally now are part of you, but God visits His people and you hear of it and you say, man, I got to go back. So she departed from the place where she was in Moab, and her 2 daughters-in-law with her, and they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. So, verse 8, And Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, Go, return each of you to her mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. May the Lord grant you that you may find rest, each in the house of her husband. Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voice and wept. So now Naomi is telling her daughters, hey, I have nothing left. I'm going back to the land of Judah so I can get some food. But you guys go back to wherever you came from, and I hope that God will bless you and deal kindly with you and give you rest. It's interesting because he says that you would find rest each in the house of her husband. Now, both of their husbands just died. So they don't even have a husband right now. So Naomi's just hoping that maybe they'll get back to Moab and maybe find another husband. Or maybe there's another option here for the 2 of them. Let's keep reading. In verse 10, And they said to her, No, but we will surely return with you to your people. But Naomi again said, "Return, my daughters. Why should you go with me? Have I yet sons in my womb, that they may be your husbands?" It's interesting because in verse 8, she refers to them as daughters-in-law, right? But when they show that they're sad and they're grieved of the loss of their husband, and they show that they want to stay with Naomi, she then refers to them just as daughters. But Naomi is pretty insistent here, saying, "Return, my daughters. Why should you go with me? I have nothing to offer you." See, the promise, Naomi is still empty-handed. She has no food. She has no husband for them to marry. She has no offspring in her womb. And she says, even if I was to get married again, would you wait for me to have another kid? But what's the response after Naomi, the promise, once again insists that they return? Verse 12, "Return, my daughters. Go, for I am too old to have a husband. And if I said I have hope, if I should even have a husband tonight and also bear sons, would you therefore wait until they were grown? Would you therefore refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, for it is harder for me than for you, for the hand of the Lord has gone forth against me." Now the promise is even recognizing that God is not for me when I am in the land of Moab. When I operate in my own strength, my own flesh, trying to preserve my own life, we find that God is not with us and for us in those moments. He has a plan to redeem us, but He is against us in our self-preservation and in our own will and in our own strength. Verse 14 says, "And they lifted up their voices and wept again. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her." Now, this is where we see the difference between Orpah and Ruth. Orpah are the things that you receive in the world, the parts of you that you found in the world and picked up in the world, that if pushed and put on under enough pressure, they will return to the things of the world. They will return to their family in Moab. But Ruth does not kiss Naomi and leave, but Ruth clings to Naomi. The thing that God used the law to acquire into Naomi's family, Ruth, is now clinging to the promise. Ruth is clinging to the promise of Naomi. So Orpah returns to the world, to the land of Moab. In verse 15, Naomi says, "Behold, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and her gods. Return after your sister-in-law." But once again, Ruth is persistent. You see, what often happens when we are in the world, we find this part of us that is so hungry, that is so lacking, that is so needy, that all we want is to be satisfied. And if we return to the world, it'll never be satisfied. But if we can recognize the promises God has given us, and in the first step, we cling to the promises. We hold on to the promises, and not being like Orpah, returning to the world, we cling to the promises. Now listen to this. This is Ruth's response to Naomi. "Do not urge me to leave you or turn back from following you. For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. Thus may the Lord do to me, and worse, if anything but death parts me from you." That's commitment. That's commitment. That's desperate commitment. That's not just a, "Hey, I'll join your team, I'll join your side." This is my only hope and my only shot. You're everything. Where you go, I go. Where you stay, I stay. Where you live, I live. Your gods are my gods. Now check this out. 2 Timothy chapter 2. 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 11. "It is a trustworthy statement. For if we died with him, we will also live with him. If we endure, we will also reign with him. If we deny him, he will also deny us. If we are faithless, he remains faithful, for he cannot deny himself." This is one of the first promises, you start to see work in Ruth's life. She's starting to catch on to something here. There's something about Ruth that is special that God has brought into the fold of Naomi, into Naomi's life. And now Ruth is clung to the promise, and she's starting to grasp, hey, wherever you go, I'm going to go. Whatever you do, where you die, I'll die. Where you live, I'll live. Where you're buried, I'll be buried. She's all in 100% because she realizes this is her only hope. Back to the book of Ruth. Keep in mind, if you die with him, you will also live with him. If you endure with him, you will also reign with him. That's a good promise and a trustworthy statement. So, verse 18, when Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more to her. So they both went until they came to Bethlehem, and when they had come to Bethlehem, all the city was stirred because of them. And the woman said, "Is this Naomi?" That's one of the questions you get when you go out into the world and you come back. Is this Daniel? Is this Naomi? Wait a second here. People don't recognize you. You probably don't even recognize yourself. But God's got a solution for that. Is this Naomi? She said to them, "Do not call me Naomi. Call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went out full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why do you call me Naomi, since the Lord has witnessed against me, and the Almighty has afflicted me?" See, this is the thing about the promise in us. When we feel like God gives us a promise and we don't see the fruition and the fruit of that, you wait long enough and what happens? We become bitter. That's what Mara means, or Mara. It means bitter. And Naomi's saying, God hasn't done anything good by me. Naomi doesn't even realize what she's picked up in Ruth, what she's got in Ruth. And the promise is bitter. It's like, why don't I have a ministry yet? Why haven't you released me yet? Why haven't I seen this in my life yet? Why haven't you give me this or give me that or taken care of this debt or this problem? We become bitter. But Naomi returned, verse 22, and with her Ruth the Moabitess, her daughter-in-law, who returned from the land of Moab, and they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. You know what usually brings people in to the land of Judah? When they see there's food there that they can eat, and they're hungry. Same with Naomi, the promise, and Ruth, the parts that were acquired in the world. They come back to Bethlehem right when that food is about to be ready. And they're hungry, and they're ready to eat. And that's good. Because in verse 2 it says, chapter 2, verse 1, Now Naomi had a kinsman or redeemer of her husband, a man of great wealth of the family of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. So, first thing you need to notice here is that the kinsman redeemer is for Naomi, okay? Naomi, who already has the bloodline of Judah and Elimelech, right? She's already been in that fold, but even the promise needs a redeemer, a kinsman redeemer. Keep that in mind. Even the promise needs a kinsman redeemer. Let's keep reading. And Ruth the Moabitess said to Naomi, "Please let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after one in whose sight I might find favor." And she said to her, "Go, my daughter." So she departed and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers. And she happened to come to the portion of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the family of Elimelech. Now behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem and said to the reapers, "May the Lord be with you." And they said to him, "May the Lord bless you." Then Boaz said to his servant who was in charge of the reapers, "Whose young woman is this?" The servant in charge of the reapers replied, "She is the young Moabite woman who returned with Naomi from the land of Moab." And she said, "Please let me glean and gather after the reapers among the sheaves." Thus she came and has remained from the morning until now. She has been sitting in the house for a little while. It's interesting because in this we see the second part of redemption for Ruth. She listens to Boaz. Now Boaz is the kinsman redeemer of the promised Naomi, right? Boaz represents Christ. He is the redeemer. And so Ruth starts to listen to Boaz. Verse 8. Then Boaz said to Ruth, "Listen carefully, my daughter. Do not go to glean in another field. Furthermore, do not go on from this one, but stay here with my maids." With my maids. That's important. Stay here with my maids. Let your eyes be on the field which they reap, and go after them. Indeed, I have commanded the servants not to touch you. When you are thirsty, go to the water jars and drink from what the servants draw. This is pretty good for Ruth, because now Ruth is getting to partake of, as long as she listens to Boaz, she's getting to partake of the harvest. She's getting to glean off of these fields. But there's some warnings that she needs to follow. Stay with the people of Boaz, and don't look off into the other fields. When the parts of us that have come out of the world come to Christ, there's two very important things that need to happen. We need to stay close in fellowship and communion with the other servants of Boaz. That would be your brethren and your sisters who have been serving, who are also in that same field. And it says, don't look to the other fields. Where are you looking? Where are we looking? When we come to Christ and He tells us, hey, you can eat, go and glean. Do we look at another field, or do we stay focused on what God has called us to in the field that He's put us in? Then she fell on her face, verse 10, bowing to the ground, and said to him, "Why have I found favor in your sight, that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner?" Boaz replied to her, "All that you have done for your mother-in-law after the death of your husband has been fully reported to me, and how you left your father and your mother and the land of your birth, and came to a people that you did not previously know." That's one of the characteristics of Ruth. Where you go, I'll go. Where you die, I'll die. Where you live, I'll live. Where you're buried, I'll be buried. Your gods will be my God. And you know what? When we have that attitude, when we have that commitment, God recognizes it. Our Redeemer recognizes it. I don't know that you can prove that Boaz would have heard it through the grapevine necessarily, all that Ruth had done. But I can guarantee you that God hears of all that you do. He knows of all that you do. And if He sees your attitude is of commitment, is of dedication, is of laying down your life to follow the promise, you will be rewarded. You will be fed. We're going to jump to verse 15. When she rose to glean, Ruth, Boaz commanded his servants, saying, "Let her glean even among the sheaves, and do not insult her. Also you shall purposely pull out for her some grain from the bundles, and leave it that she may glean, and do not rebuke her." So she gleaned in the field until evening. Then she beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. She took it up and went into the city, and her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned. She also took it out and gave Naomi what she had left after she was satisfied. See, that's the thing about the Ruths in us, that when we're committed, when we give all to the promise of what God has, God even gives us some of the good stuff that we absolutely have no right to, we don't deserve by any means. But God says, I'm going to go so far as to take it out of the sheaves so that you can have some of the good stuff. Not just the leftovers, but I'm going to give you some of the good stuff. And Ruth recognizes that, hey, this is some of the good stuff. And she takes it back to Naomi, the promise. And she feeds Naomi. Now, what does this speak of us? Those parts of us that were in the world, came out of the world by clinging to the promise still hasn't really got to eat yet. The promise is still wondering, hey, what's going on? The promise told Naomi to go into this field and glean. Naomi told Ruth, the promise told Ruth, this parts of our soul, to go glean in this field that God has. And God has told us, hey, I'm going to feed you from this field, but don't leave here. Stay committed. Stay with these people and keep your eyes here. And so Ruth takes some food back to Naomi, because the things that God starts to feed and satisfy that came out of the world in us, we can use that to help feed the promise, to say, hey, the reality is real. There is a Redeemer. There is a Redeemer. Continuing in chapter 2, verse 23. Once again, it says, Ruth, so she stayed close by the maids of Boaz in order to glean until the end of the barley harvest and the wheat harvest, and she lived with her mother-in-law. She lived with the promise and was fed. Once again, staying close to her brothers and sisters, to those who belonged and served Boaz. Chapter 3, verse 1. Then Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, my daughter, shall I not seek rest for you, that it may be well with you? Now is not Boaz our kinsman redeemer, with whose maids you were? Behold, he winnows barley at the threshing floor tonight. Wash yourself, therefore, anoint yourself, put on your best clothes, and go down to the threshing floor. But do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. It shall be when he lies down that you shall notice the place where he lies, and you shall go and uncover his feet and lie down. Then he will tell you what you shall do. Now, Naomi says, shall I not seek rest for you, that it may be well with you? The promise that God has given us is looking for rest to those parts of us that have come out of the world. Whatever it may be, whatever it may look like, those parts of us that have come out of the world, the promise will be looking for rest for us, and will say, go. And it shall be when he lies down that you shall notice the place where he lies, and you shall go and uncover his feet and lie down. Then he will tell you what you shall do. Naomi is telling Ruth, the promise is telling the parts of us that come out of the world to go to the kinsman redeemer and lay down at his feet. Don't bother him yet. Don't speak to him. But where you see him rest and lie down at his feet and wait for him to give you direction. What does this speak of? Well, this speaks of that Christ, what is his place of rest? His throne, right? And if we will listen to the promise, and if we will go to the throne where Jesus is sitting in a place of rest, ruling and reigning from a position of rest. And if we will wait and be patient at his feet, he will tell us what to do. And Ruth says, all that you've said, I'm going to do it. The next thing in the process of redemption for Ruth is you got to lie down at the feet of Jesus. You got to lie down before his throne. You got to lie down and wait for him at the feet of Jesus, at his feet. Skipping to verse 10. In the middle of the night, Boaz wakes up, kind of says, who are you? And she says, I'm Ruth. Then Boaz says, may you be blessed of the Lord, my daughter. You have shown your last kindness to be better than the first by not going after young men, whether poor or rich. That's a good one right there. That's a good one right there. It's hard to lay down at the feet of Jesus. And why is it hard? Because of money and other young men. we may think that Jesus doesn't look like the best option. We may think that Jesus may not have all the provision that we want or need. But if we will lie at his feet before his throne, we will be redeemed, just as Ruth will be redeemed. But it's important that we don't chase after young men or young women, for myself, and money. Whether it's a little bit of money or whether it's a lot of bit of money, that doesn't matter. If you're chasing after money, you're not lying down at the feet of Jesus. If you're chasing after and pursuing young men or young women, you're not lying at the feet of Jesus. That's the next step. Lie at the feet of Jesus and stay there and wait. Don't go after money. Don't go after the opposite sex. Verse 11. Now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you whatever you ask, for all my people in the city know that you are a woman of excellence. This is pretty good right here. This is what I enjoy about Ruth. She is a woman of excellence. A woman of excellence. She lies down at the feet of Jesus. She clings to the promise. She listens to the promise. She lies down at the feet of Jesus. She doesn't chase money. She doesn't chase men. All she wants is the Redeemer. All she wants is the kinsman Redeemer. An excellent woman, all they want is the Redeemer. All they want and desire is the Redeemer. That's a good point. That's a good point. Hope you get that one. An excellent woman, all they want is the Redeemer. I'm going to leave it at that. So, verse 12. Now it is true, I am a close relative or Redeemer. However, there is a Redeemer closer than I. So, we have a little bit of a problem here. Ruth has found Boaz, and she's discovering Boaz is pretty great. But Boaz says, Redeemer, the kinsman Redeemer says, well, wait a second. There's someone closer to you than I am who can redeem you. We're going to find out who this is. But he says, remain this night, and when morning comes, if he will redeem you, good, let him redeem you. But if he does not wish to redeem you, then I will redeem you. As the Lord lives, lie down until morning. So, what is this other Redeemer? We're going to jump down to chapter 4, starting in verse 5. And what happens here is that Boaz has gone to this other Redeemer, and he's got witnesses, about 10 witnesses around him, and he is talking to this other Redeemer. And he says, verse 5, then Boaz said, on the day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you must also acquire Ruth the Moabitess, the widow of the deceased, in order to raise up the name of the deceased on his inheritance. The kinsman Redeemer said, I cannot redeem it for myself because I would jeopardize my own inheritance. Redeem it for yourself. You may have my right of redemption, for I cannot redeem it. So what is the first Redeemer? The first Redeemer is the law. But the wages of sin is death, right? And the law, all it can do is produce death. And if the law was to accept someone who was against or had broken the law, it would be in jeopardy of its own nature, its own character, would it not? If the law came to you and I and said, it's okay if you messed up, man, I'll still accept you. That's not going to happen because the law cannot redeem something that is not righteous. Ruth came from the world, came from a land of self-preservation. she was not righteous. She was of the people of incest, who had been born from incest. And so the law cannot redeem Ruth. One thing you need to learn about yourself, the ruse in you and in me cannot be redeemed by the law. The parts of you that come out of the world cannot be redeemed by the law. Just can't happen, because the law cannot redeem you. So, Boaz finds out that the closer relative, the law, cannot redeem Ruth or Naomi. Remember, the kinsman redeemer is for the promise and also for Ruth, the parts of us that come out of the world that have chosen to cling to the promise. So, chapter 4, verse 11 says, all the people who were in the court and the elders said, we are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your home like Rachel and Leah, both of whom built the house of Israel. And may you achieve wealth in Ephratah and become famous in Bethlehem. Now, this is pretty incredible here, because the promise that these people, these elders, are giving to Boaz is that as he redeems Naomi and Ruth, that Ruth, who will be his wife, will become complete in him. So the parts of us that are like Ruth, that have come out of the world, they may still be needy, they may still be really hungry, but it is prophesied that they shall become like Rachel and Leah, both of whom built the house of Israel. This speaks to the completeness that God wants to build in us. God doesn't want to just give us Rachel or just give us Leah or make us just like Rachel or just like Leah. But He wants us to be complete. And as He redeems us, He will work that completeness out. Verse 14. Or let's just keep reading in verse 12. Moreover, may your house be like the house of Perez, who Tamar bore to Judah, through the offspring which the Lord will give you by this young woman. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife, and he went into her, and the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. Then the women said to Naomi, why are they talking to Naomi, first of all, right? It's like Ruth is the one who's going to have the baby. Why are they talking to Naomi? But they say to Naomi, blessed is the Lord who has not left you without a redeemer today. And may his name become famous in Israel. Then may he also be to you a restorer of life and a sustainer of your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you and is better to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him. Then Naomi took the child and laid him in her lap and became his nurse. The neighbor woman gave him a name, saying, a son has been born to Naomi. So they named him Obed. He is the father of Jesse, the father of David. And so, as you know, David, through his line, gives birth to Jesus, right? So, but this is something about Ruth that we miss, is that the women really give credit to Naomi for what's being birthed, okay? And that's okay, because the promise is the only reason Ruth is there in the first place. The parts of you that have come out of the world, the parts of you that you don't fully understand, the parts of you that God didn't promise but maybe He still wants to redeem, it only happens by the promise. Through the kinsman redeemer, through Christ. So Ruth gives birth, but it's seen as Naomi's son. And spiritually that's true. People are going to recognize, even if I come out of the world and say, man, I used to do this and do that, and man, I lived such a horrible life. people aren't going to say, hey, Christ came out of that horrible life. People are going to say, Christ came out of the plan and the promise he had for you even before you messed it all up, right? You ever share your testimony with someone and, man, he had you from the beginning. There was a promise he gave to you. And you may have went into the world and gotten some bad places and messed up some things and did the wrong thing and got into some darkness. But because of the promise, he's going to use all that stuff that came out of the world to birth, ultimately, Christ and the line of Christ. And it says that Ruth's love is better than 7 sons. How can that be? Now, if you look at it, Rachel and Leah had Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, okay? Then Gad and Asher, okay? Then Bilhah had Dan, Naphtali. Then Leah's handmaid had Gad and Asher. Then Rachel's handmaid had Issachar and Zebulun. Or Leah's handmaid had Issachar and Zebulun. Then Rachel had Joseph and Benjamin. That's a lot to get. I'm trying to do that off the top of my head, but it's a little difficult. So, neither Rachel nor Leah, whether through their handmaids or not, gave birth to 7 sons. They only gave birth to 6, Rachel and Leah, through their handmaids, never more than 7. And so what this is saying again is that God is going to make you complete. The love that Ruth has is going to be better than the love of 7 sons. That's pretty good, y'all. So, as Ruth fulfills the destiny that God has for her and is redeemed by Boaz, and the birth that she gives is still according to the promise, there's 2 things that can happen to Ruth after she's redeemed. And this is where I want to end. One is that Ruth takes on shame. She becomes ashamed of herself. The first reason she's going to become ashamed of herself is because she came out of the world and she was not able to be redeemed by the law, the closest relative. And see, think about it. Think about your own life. Ask yourself, the parts of you that have come out of the world, do you not carry shame because how you should have been redeemed through the law cannot redeem you? And when you can't be redeemed by the law, what happens? You have shame on yourself. And you need that second redeemer. You need Christ to redeem you. He's the only one who can redeem you. But Ruth has to be careful of taking on shame because she couldn't fulfill the law, because she couldn't be redeemed by the law. The second thing is that Ruth isn't recognized and affirmed as giving birth to Obed. Now, people may know it, but she's never affirmed necessarily in the public of giving birth to that son. It's giving credit to Naomi. And what happens is that the Ruths in us, even when they've been redeemed and they start to bear fruit and start to produce and give birth to what God has, a lot of times it's not going to be affirmed and recognized by those out there. And if we allow ourselves and the parts of us that are like Ruth to have shame and carry shame, we're not going to be focusing on all that God has given us, on Obed, on Jesse, on David. Now think about this. In the book of Matthew, in the genealogy of Jesus, Ruth is given credit as the wife of Boaz. Naomi is not. But what this shows is that as the Ruths in us, as they continue to live out the life that God has for them, those parts of us that we may have found in the world that we were scared of, that was like, hey, I didn't know I had this in me. Hey, I didn't know I had this kind of passion or desire or this kind of feeling or this kind of anger. As God redeems that and he continues to redeem, and you walk in that redemption, you can know that it's going to be recognized in the history that God gives as being married to Boaz, and in the one who gives birth to the line that follows. This is the promise that God gives us, and the reason we don't need to be ashamed is because, one, we have a Redeemer, Jesus Christ, who wants to redeem us, who is happy to redeem us, who will redeem us and even give to us before we've been redeemed, but also because God will recognize those parts of us that cling to the promise, and he will affirm those parts of us. He will give credit to the Ruth in us that says, I want the promise. I want the destiny. I want the God of Naomi. In my own life, I've kind of been struggling with shame here recently, and part of the reason God brought this message, I think, was to speak to me about it. And I realized in my own life, in the shame that I have about choices I made, mistakes I've made, my own story, my own past, whatever it may be, I realized that to carry that shame, it doesn't just do a disservice to me, but it does a disservice to the Redeemer. And we have to be bold enough, even in the parts of us that have come out of the world, to say, hey, I'm married to Boaz. I'm married to the Redeemer. He has redeemed me. And he hasn't just redeemed me. He's redeemed me. And he's fed me. And he has conceived in me a child. And there shall be fruit from his redemption. And that's what God's been speaking to me. Daniel, the Ruths in you, you need to start giving credit to the fact that God redeemed that part of you. God redeemed Ruth in you. And you need to give credit to Boaz, your Redeemer, to Christ, your Redeemer, and acknowledge that he has redeemed you, not just for yourself, but also in front of others. There's no shame we need to carry. There's no shame in being redeemed. There's no shame in not being able to fulfill the law. Don't worry about it. Christ has come to redeem you, and he wants to redeem you. And the parts of you that you have shame in, God wants to redeem those parts so that you can be affirmed, so that you can know his presence, his life, his provision, and you can live in it every day. In Jesus' name. I want to pray for you. If you like for me to pray for you, I want you to come up to the front. And I just want to pray against the shame of Ruth, that the shame would be broken, that the Holy Spirit would release us from that shame by the blood of Jesus, because Jesus bears our shame. When Boaz went and paid the price for us, he didn't just pay the price for us as a person.